Final session of the afternoon, which is Global Leadership and Complex Crises. Keith Porter from the Foundation is going to be the moderator, and we'll introduce the panel experts.
All right, thanks, Bill. Again, on behalf of the Stanley Foundation, let me thank everyone for being here, and thanks to the Gerda Hinkle people and Thomson Reuters for all the work they've done as well. This is an area that is just so important to the Stanley Foundation and the work that we've been doing. There are two, I just want to start off by talking about two big interrelated developments in world affairs that really sort of sit at the top of a pyramid here that I think we need to pay attention to. One of them gets a lot of attention, one not so much attention. The one that gets a lot of attention is the rise of new powers, the emergence of rising powers in the world. The BRIC countries, beyond the BRIC countries, South Africa, Mexico, and more. There's been a lot of attention paid to the fact that these countries are growing in the share of the global marketplace and how important they are to the global economy. I think not so much attention has been paid to the fact that the global governance system of the world has been very slow to react to these rising powers, and the systems, being set up back in 1945, post World War II, and even the reforms that were made post Cold War, really don't take into account the fact that we have many more players. We live in a much more multipolar world than we ever have. There's a real mismatch between the actual power structure and the way the systems are set up. There has been some evolution in the global governance system. IMF voting rights being the most outstanding one, where there was actual reform done. The G20 moved from the foreign minister level to the head of state level. About 10 years ago, the G20 started meeting at the finance minister level, and then in 2008, because of the global financial crisis, moved to the heads of state level. And we actually have a body there that's fairly representative, certainly much more representative than the Security Council or than the G8. You've got 80% of the world's population, 80% of the world's economy represented at the G20. But there are still problems there, of course. For one thing, it's a very diverse group. You've got democracies and dictatorships and communist systems and capitalist systems all sitting around the table, and the jury is still out about whether or not they can actually make decisions. There's also been changes at the G8. First of all, it's expanded from the G6 to the G7 to the G8, but their agenda has also evolved. This last G8, just a couple of weeks ago in Deauville, talked very little really about financial matters. Most of the attention went to their discussion of the Arab Spring, their discussion of internet security. They spent a lot of time on the global partnership on weapons of mass destruction. So they've really become a body that's becoming much more about peace and security issues, particularly since the G20 has been designated as the premier forum on global financial matters. We also have sort of ad hoc head of state summitry. You'll remember last year, President Obama called a nuclear security summit in Washington. Next year, that'll be followed up by another head of state summit on nuclear security in South Korea. That's just one example of an ad hoc response to world affairs. Part of the reason we need all these things, why the G20 seem to come out of nowhere, why you see these ad hoc head of state meetings coming about, really is because they are workarounds. They're sort of kludges to a global governance system that really doesn't work and doesn't reflect the global power structure today. In fact, some things like the United Nations seem almost beyond reform. So today we have a couple of experts with us here who will be connecting very real, very current issues to this larger framework of changes and experimentation in the high-level global governance system. On this side, I have Greg Austin, and over here, Paul Rogers. Paul Rogers will be going first, and Paul is from the University of Bradford. Yes, please, Paul.
Great, thanks so much indeed. What I'd like to try and do is to just summarize what appear to be the major international challenges over the next 15 to 20 years and see whether the kinds of systems of global governance are in any way relevant or capable in responding to the problems we face. One can summarize the complexity of what we face in terms of three words: economy, environment, security. I wasn't able to attend the whole of this seminar, but I've been here only for today, and I am aware that much of the seminar has been focused on aspects of international security, but also to some extent on the environment, particularly on climate change. If one can look at the challenges which the interplay of these three broad areas of human activity throw up, then one can then begin to at least get some idea of the problems that are going to be faced and how we react to them. I'll concentrate very briefly on going through those, and I'll do a little bit more on the economy because the other two aspects have been so much a focus over the last couple of days. If you look at the world economy, we moved really into what people tend to term the neoliberal era of international economic organization, round about 1980. Reaganomics, Thatcherism, the Washington Consensus on the IMF, World Bank. It was something of a change from the previous 30 or so years where you had rather more mixed economic functioning. It has delivered growth. The overall economic growth worldwide has not been at the level of the period from 1945 to 1980. It's been rather slower, but it has been delivered. However, I think one of the things that we do have to face is that the neoliberal market system, while it delivers a degree of growth, is not delivering any sense of equity. There has been a steadily widening divide over the past 30 years between an elite, and I'll define that term in a moment, and the rest. Now, when I use the term elite, I'm not talking about an elite group right at the top. I'm talking about 1.5 billion people, including all of us here. There has been a trend, a very clear trend over the last 30 years, that the great majority of the benefits of global economic growth has been focused on about 1.5 billion out of the world's population, which is about to hit 7 billion. So you have a very large margin, a very large marginalized majority. There seems to be no end to this trend. It's started to take root in the 1970s and it's continued since. Various measures of it. Household wealth, 10% of the world's households have 85% of the wealth. Annual income, 20% of the world's population has about 85% of the income. You measure it in different ways, but that is tending to widen rather than narrow. It has developed over several decades. At the same time, when there's been tremendous success in aspects of human development relating particular to education, literacy and communication. People are far better educated, more knowledgeable, and are able to communicate better than, say, 40 years ago. You put those two together, and there is an overall tendency to get not what the sociologists called 30 years ago the revolution of rising expectations, but the revolution of frustrated expectations. And as I say, when I'm talking about margins, I'm talking about the majority. And when I talk about an elite, I'm not talking about rich country, poor country, because that is the other very major change. We live in a much more of a transglobal system, so that in current day India, you would probably have maybe 70 to 80 million people who would have a similar level of income to the 40 million people in Britain who would consider themselves middle class. China probably even more, over 100 million, maybe substantially more than 100 million. But this division is essentially worldwide. As I say, it is not narrowing, if anything it is widening. And there are very big questions about the nature of the world economy and how it has evolved. I should add also that as far as one can tell, the economic problems in the Western financial system of 2008 have largely been ignored as an indicator of basic problems. And the tendency now is to think that we are still back to the old style of doing things. There's no real reconceptualization of what needs to be done to get a more emancipated and equitable economic system. I won't say much about environmental constraints, that's been covered already, but just to summarize, and that is that we do live in a world which has these divisions. What we are coming up against very clearly is a range of environmental constraints. On the resource side, obviously, the extraordinary narrow concentration of oil and gas reserves, but climate change is by far the most important. That, in a sense, is the game changer. Just as a sort of minor thing, it's probably the only thing that you remember from what I say this afternoon. My wife and I have a small holding 200 miles north of here in the eastern Pennine Hills, and I planted a vineyard 10 years ago, and I have some quite decent wine maturing in the cellar at the present time, which I could not have done 20 years ago. So just personal indication of climate change happening. But the marker here is that when climate change science really developed 25 to 30 years ago, there was an assumption based on reasonable evidence that it would have its major impact on the temperate latitudes and the polar regions. What is now much more clear is that it is a global phenomenon with a very big impact on the tropical and subtropical regions where the majority of people live and where most of the food is grown. The likely changes are going to be a progressive drying out of the tropical and subtropical land masses. You put that together with the problems of the socioeconomic divide, and one begins to get the picture of the complex challenges we'll be facing. And then finally, you have what you might call the major security paradigm, which essentially is one of maintaining the status quo, maintaining control. In many ways, I think the conduct of the war on terror was a very strong example of this. The need to maintain control in the face of what was a pretty dire and very vicious attack in the continental United States. All the problems that have arisen with that so far suggest that that kind of control paradigm is limited in its value in terms of the problems we face. The word I have for it is lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than going to the underlying problems which are causing the future stresses. What I think is becoming clear is that we are moving into an era over the next 10, maybe 15 years in which there has to be a radical reorientation of economic organization to narrow the divide, and also the movement to radically decarbonize modern industrial economies to move to a low-carbon era. That is essential if you're going to get serious control of climate change. We're not talking about 80% carbon output reduction by 2050. We're talking about that by 2030 at the very latest. So we are into a potentially a transformative era. If we don't move in that direction, then I think what one can see is the tendency for major sets of conflicts, of which we have some very rough models at the present time. I would characterize this as an age of revolts from the margins. But let's just deconstruct the two terms, revolts and margins. As I said, the margins are the majority, not the minority. And revolts do not necessarily mean violent revolts. They can mean major examples of civil uprisings we've seen with the Arab Spring. And I was remarked this morning, one major element of that, in addition to the desire for more freedom and democracy against autocracies, has been the underlying economic environment across much of the Middle East, along with the demographic transitions of very large numbers of educated people going in, not into the employment pools, but into the unemployment pools. So I think essentially you have this risk of revolts from the margins, which would be exacerbated on the current trends which we're seen to face. What then of the role of what you might broadly call the intergovernmentals? I think essentially I would actually be rather jaundiced about what the current levels of global organization, global governance are able to do. The UN has already been commented on. I would say one thing about the UN, and that is on a number of occasions, some of its specialized agencies have actually been very good at indicating the problems that lie ahead. UN Environment Programme back in the early 1980s was very effective in raising the issue of ozone depletion. And action happened very quickly on that. Some of the more recent work of UNEP on climate change, similarly good. On the economic side, it's a very interesting exercise to go right back to the founding of the UN Conference on Trade and Development in 1964, to look at the Raoul Prebisch report of 63 towards a trade policy for development, in what it was articulating about the way in which you could have a rather more planned international economy which would link trade with development. So one must accept that in some areas, even an organization like the UN can provide a degree of prophetic analysis which can be very valuable. I have to say that I think the coalition of groups which we normally term the IMF, World Bank and World Trade Organization seem to be thoroughly incompetent in recognizing the nature of the economic divide as it develops and responding to it. And I have to say that in many ways, while we are moving into an era of new rising powers, the BRICS, the G8 through to the G20, all of those powers to a greater or lesser extent are enjoying more and more divisions with their own societies. And I think the problem is we see the move from the G8 to the G20 as more representative. It is in one sense, but in another sense it's representative of an elite stratum, which is also very anxious about its own position. To put it another way, one could argue that there have been two movements of the last 10 or so years which may be indicative of the kinds of problems that we're going to face in the future. I'm not saying in any way that these movements are going to expand and be dominant, but they're interesting markers, symptoms, if you like. One is Al-Qaeda. The interesting thing about that, it is a transnational revolutionary movement with very clear revolutionary aims, but very unusually for a revolutionary movement, it is eschatological in the sense that it looks beyond this life because it stems from religious rather than political, ethnic or nationalist conditioning. So essentially that I think is a very interesting marker because you may well get movements like that in which you have a very strong element of religious belief at the root of them. The other movement, which I think is hugely underrated for its significance, is the Naxalite Neo-Maoist rebellion in India. A rebellion which is now affecting more than half the states of that nation, which Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, has described as the biggest single security threat to India. And it is, if you like, a classic revolt from the margins. As interestingly, although not in the form of a single movement, you're seeing in China. All the major problems in China, not widely reported outside some of the Hong Kong webs, of social unrest, strikes and the rest, and the force with which they are put down by the public authorities, are also indicators of this kind of trend. I would have to say that in many ways, major intergovernmentals such as the European Union on the economic side, NATO on the security side, seem unable to cope with this changing global environment. And it is being left more, I think, to non-governmental civil society elements to be more active. I think the most interesting thing at the present time is that in one sense, we're in an era which I would define as a prophetic era where prophecy is defined as suggesting the possible. I think some of the most interesting thinking being done at present is actually being done in think tanks in the North and the South. Groups like Focus on the Global South in Manila, in Britain, the Great Transition Project of the New Economics Foundation, which is about an emancipated low econometric modelling, the sustainable security work done by Oxford Research Group, similar work going on in the United States. So what I think we're in at present is an era in which I'm not sure that the organs of global governance are able to cope with the problems that are going to face us, at least for the present. Now, the one area which, in a curious way, rather sadly in a way, may give grounds for optimism, is that there's now, I think, pretty clear evidence that while climate change, which is the game changer, is going to kick in over 15 to 20 years, it's going to be marked in the much shorter term, not by more frequent extreme weather conditions, but by more extreme versions of weather conditions. And that, I think, may be the beginnings of a wake-up call of what actually has to be explored in terms of changes in global governance. So there is some area for cautious optimism. But I'm bound to say that if you look at these major issues, the really big problems facing us, I don't see too much evidence that the organs of global governance are in a position to cope, even though they are broadening out, which is always a very good thing. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.